What's up, people? How you doing? One of the most intriguing aspects of the Thousand-Year Blood War was the concept of the 5 special war potentials. It goes without saying that Yuha Bak and his army of Quincy's were the greatest threats Soul Society faced in their entire history. They had a millennium of intel and preparation to work with since their last defeat, all of this while their enemies were none the wiser. Meanwhile, Soul Society in the same period of time had grown considerably weaker, with Yamamoto's age and injuries taking a toll on him, not to mention the lingering effects in the aftermath of Aizen's invasion. In addition, the primordial squad captains of the Gotei 13, who were bloodthirsty and hardened by war, had been replaced by the current relatively inexperienced, peace-loving bunch. Objectively speaking, the odds were immensely stacked against the Shinigami. But even with all the time and countermeasures in the world, there still existed factors that Yuha Bak could not control. 5 people in particular that could turn the tide of battle against his army that he had to keep in check, and he referred to them as the special war potentials. Before we delve into the 5 characters, I just want to remind you to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell notification. It would really be a great help to me and to the growth of this channel, and it would only take a second. The people on this list, through their particular qualities and specialities, were flagged as potentially dangerous elements in the war against the Quincy. If Yuha Bak couldn't recruit them over to his side, the Quincy were under orders to exercise extreme caution when fighting them. Aizen for his immense spiritual power, Kenpachi for his combat strength, Ichigo for his potential or latent ability, Ichibe for his wisdom or knowledge, and Kisuke for his unknown methods or incalculable tricks. I'm gonna go ahead and start with Aizen because he's the first person that Yuha Bak directly establishes contact with. Yuha uses the first invasion of the Wandenreich and the ensuing chaos to travel down to the Muken where Aizen is being imprisoned. He attempts to use their shared ambition to take down the Soul King as a way to convince him to join him, but Aizen wants nothing to do with him. On the contrary, he actually takes this chance to use Kyoka Suigetsu's complete hypnosis to throw off Yuha's sense of time, which inadvertently ends up saving Ichigo later on. Aizen made it on this list due to his monstrous spiritual power. And this really isn't anything new. During the course of the series, it became very apparent that he was simply on another level. As a rogue captain, he used his spiritual power to subdue the Espada and keep them in check. I remember the time when Grimmjow was getting out of line and all Aizen had to do was release his spiritual pressure. And almost like he was being hit by a surge of gravity, Grimmjow was immediately on his knees and completely immobilized. After being released by Kyoraku, when the Soul King's spiritual power is coming down and about to engulf the Seirete, and there's multiple captains and vice captains in the area. I think Rukia and Renji were there, Shinji, Byakuya, Kyoraku, just a bunch of seated officers were around. And majority of them are in a panic, and Aizen just casually destroys the Soul King's Reiatsu with his Kido, all of this while stuck to his chair in sealing restraints. To put the icing on the cake, he then attempts to shoot down the royal palace using what? You guessed it, his spiritual power, and if it hadn't been for the restraints, I'm willing to bet he would have succeeded. Even for Kyoka Suigetsu's hypnosis to work on the Almighty in their final battle, Aizen's spiritual pressure had to have exceeded that of Yuha Bak, and this is his form after fusing with the Soul King we're talking about. Yuha had more than enough reason to be wary of Aizen's spiritual power because it's ultimately what made the hypnosis so potent, giving Ichigo an opening to deal the final blow. Zaraki Kenpachi oozes pure unadulterated raw power. At the start of the Quincy invasion, he defeated 3 Standrita off-screen, presumably with his eye patch still on. He won the battle against Gremmy when Gremmy imagined himself having power equal to Kenpachi, and the next second his body transformed into this monstrosity before falling apart and ultimately leading to his death. A testament to the inconceivable depth of strength that lay within him. His power was so vast that he was able to subconsciously manifest it in the form of another Shinigami, his vice captain Yachiru, who by the way also had a fairly intricate Zanpakuto, or at least what we thought was a Zanpakuto at the time, because as it turns out, she herself and everything she conjured was simply a figment of a fraction of Zaraki's power come to life. After releasing just a tiny fragment of his power in Bankai form, his own body couldn't handle the strain and started breaking down, meaning he hadn't even begun to scratch the surface of what his power was capable of. His name alone is a title bestowed on the strongest Shinigami in every generation, and he earns it way before he learns his Shikai or his Bankai. In fact, the Central 46, the governing body of the Seirete, forbade Yamamoto from teaching him Kendo in the fear that he would become too powerful to control if he ever rebelled against Soul Society. Listen, probably the biggest understatement I can make is that Kenpachi is a berserker of abnormal proportions, and if the Quincy weren't worried about him, I would have sincerely doubted their sanity. Sure, he doesn't get to fight the real Yhwach and he falls victim to his own power in the end, but he takes down way more Quincy's on his own than anybody else, and that's a feat that definitely can't be overlooked. At every turn, Ichigo has shown an absurd propensity for growth and survival instinct. Against Kenpachi, he learns to communicate with his Zanpakuto and amplify his Shinigami powers. Obviously, in hindsight, it turned out to be the source of his Quincy powers, but nonetheless, within the span of a few seconds, he was able to unlock a segment of his power that was previously dormant. Before going up against Byakuya, he acquires his Bankai in under 3 days, a feat that would arguably take 10 years for other Shinigami. On the brink of death against Ulquiorra, the Hollow Within revives him and defeats the fourth Espada. In order to defeat Aizen, he spends almost 3 months in the Dangai world, an equivalent of just an hour in the real world, to obtain the final Getsuga Tensho and finally overcome him. After losing his Shinigami powers, he awakens his Fullbring abilities at an astonishing speed, etc., etc. Each of these events was observed by the Quincy, which is why his potential was deemed a threat by Yhwach. In their first confrontation, Ichigo subconsciously uses Blut Veen to tank his attacks, and at that moment, rather than kill the main character, Yuha's immediate response is to subdue him and sort of re-educate him into joining the Quincy ranks. I mean, that was the intent all along, but the spontaneous awakening of Ichigo's Quincy blood definitely expedites things. And I think he does this because he knows the impact someone like Ichigo, who's been designated as a war potential, can make. Unfortunately for him, he runs out of time and has to retreat. Over the years, Ichigo's mixed lineage has become a running joke when you consider the plot armor his parentage has accorded him. Speaking of his parentage, if you want to know more about that, I implore you to check out my video discussing the events of Everything But the Rain. Or just go plain old-fashioned and read the manga. My educated but also biased opinion is that doing both would be ideal. But if you have to do one or the other, something resembling self-preservation dictates that I recommend my own content. Links in the description. Far from that needlessly long and apologetically shameless plug, Ichigo being a hybrid is precisely what makes him a wildcard in the eyes of the Quincy. Even when he trains with Squad Zero and manages to marry the 3 identities within him, he does so at breakneck speed. After this training, he confronts Yuha once again and attempts to use his new Bankai, but this time Yuha isn't having any of that. Even with the Almighty, there's no telling what a hybrid like Ichigo is capable of, so he nips it in the bud by breaking his sword. And he doesn't just do it in the current timeline, he does it in all the futures he can perceive. That's how much he was scared of Ichigo's potential. And for good reason, because once Tsukishima and Orihime worked together to restore his blade, he ultimately landed the finishing blow on the god that was Yhwach. Hyosube Ichibe, the High Priest, leader of the Royal Guard, creator and custodian of names, and the last line of defense in the Spirit Palace. As one of the progenitors, it's no exaggeration to say that his very existence enshrines the history of Soul Society itself. Yuha considered him a special war potential due to his vast knowledge acquired through his perpetual tenure as the Soul King's protector. Holding the title of monk who calls the real name, Ichibe possesses an inherent ability to discern the true nature of all things and the wisdom to strategize against any and all opponents. His Zanpakuto is capable of some of the craziest thing I've seen in Bleach. Instead of cutting through flesh, it cuts through the names of things it touches, severely weakening their innate power. In its Shikai state, it releases ink that strips the power of anything it comes into contact with by sealing its name. Probably the most broken ability in the hands of one of the oldest and most insightful characters in the entire series. And even as a relatively unexplored character, it comes as no surprise that he was the only Shinigami to completely dominate Yhwach in battle. It was only the most marginal of defeats, as Ichibe's control was undone by the very untimely intervention of the Almighty, but his performance in the battle, results notwithstanding, more than justifies his inclusion on the list. We all know Kisuke is not just a plain old candy store owner like he says. I mean, technically he is, but that's not all he is. He's also the founder of the Shinigami Research and Development Institute, former captain of the 12th Division, and arguably the smartest person in the Bleach universe. He outwardly portrays this image of being carefree and eccentric, but when someone like Aizen praises your intellect as he did for Kisuke on multiple occasions, you know that the other side of the coin holds a deceptively cunning individual who prefers to mask his intelligence and intentions. Kisuke made it on this list for his incalculable tricks, and this generally means that he had this superhuman level of intellect to be able to predict all the possible scenarios in a given situation and adequately prepare for each and every one of them. When Mugetsu Ichigo weakens Aizen, it's Kisuke's technique that manages to seal him. A technique he concealed within another Kido multiple chapters prior, all the while anticipating this turn of events. One of the trump cards of the Quincy in the earlier chapters was the ability to steal Bankai, which undoubtedly left a number of the squad captains in a severely weakened state. You had Kyoraku saying these are not enemies that could be defeated without using your Bankai, sentiments which were later echoed by Renji. And it's none other than Kisuke who, by thinking outside the box, was able to counter with the solution of temporary holification. He was also the brains behind the plan that involved recruiting the Fullbringers Yukio and Riruka to send Ichigo's group up to the Soul King Palace. Characters you wouldn't even imagine would show up, especially considering how trivial of an existence they posed in this potentially world-ending war. And yet Kisuke managed to optimize their bizarre abilities without directly placing them in the line of fire. His battle with Askin reveals more of his predictive prowess. His Bankai is particularly unorthodox, which I guess is an appropriate reflection of his innate nature. But it's his shrewd and methodical planning that ultimately gets him out of jail, so to speak. Unable to move and at risk of being done in by Askin's Gift Ball Deluxe, Nell appears like clockwork to save him from his predicament, and in her own words, "I can't believe it. It really did come down to one of the 5 possibilities he mentioned." He obviously referring to Kisuke. He is a schemer that always had a plan behind the plan, and even when that failed, he still had an intricate maze of plans at his disposal that only he could maneuver. It wouldn't be an overstatement to say that Kisuke's claws ran deep in every counter-response the Shinigami had against the Quincy. He was the guy behind the scenes, and the Quincy lost because they failed to keep him in check. I think given the obvious time constraints, Kubo did a brilliant job at portraying the special war potentials. Not necessarily in relation to their general image or intentions, cause we could argue that Aizen could have been a greater force to be reckoned with, or that Ichigo's blade constantly being broken from a reader's point of view is utterly ridiculous, and so forth and so on. But it's more to do with the roles they played and how integral each of them were in the war. Flashy or not, each of them through their presence and their actions influenced the momentum of the war, which is precisely why they deserved their reputation as the special war potentials. What do you guys think about them? Did each of them live up to their name as a war potential? And if not, who else do you think should have been on the list? Leave your comments down below, I'd love to get some feedback. If you got to the end of the video, smash the like button, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. Until next time, stay safe. Peace!